Hey guys, welcome back to Little Firefly Artworks, and we're here today with a completely new project. For this one, I'm going to be drawing a Pale-Faced Rosella, which is one of my all-time favourite Australian birds. I don't see them as much now where I live on the Sunshine Coast, but I do get occasional glimpses of them, and every time I do, it always makes my heart feel really happy. They're also incredibly beautiful. I love the transition from yellow to blue on their feathers, and that they've got hints of green, and I don't know, I've just always been a little bit fascinated by them. Now to start off, obviously I have to do the sketch. You can see that I made many revisions while doing this because I couldn't get the proportions of the bird to look exactly how I wanted them to, and by the end of it, it's still not perfect, but I'm happy enough with it. I've never followed what I would call the traditional guides to drawing, so where you kind of map it out before you start putting it down. I've always been the kind of artist who prefers to just sketch it, so a lot of my art style is pretty much the case of let's dive in head first and see where we end up. And honestly, I don't think I'd like to do it any other way. I think I have the most fun doing it in a way that gets me in trouble, and then I have to try and figure out how to get out of trouble. Once I'm happy with the overall shape of the bird, I go through and just kind of roughly add in some elements of the background that I want to keep. For this drawing, I'm using the Aquarello watercolor paper. It's cold pressed and is A3 in size. It is fairly textured, and I have used this paper with a mixed medium watercolor and Prismacolor artwork that I did previously. I did find that I struggled a little bit to make the pencil look flat because of the rough texture of the paper, but it gave it this really rustic, drawn effect that I actually kind of really liked when I finished. And then I work back over the bird sketch and try to add a little bit more detail that I can use when I'm actually blocking in colour later. So especially focusing on the different feathers in the wing and making sure that I've got each fold, I suppose. While I'm doing this, I fix up any of the proportions that aren't exactly right, and I just try to add in some kind of loose guidelines for where the prominent feathers are. I was already in the process of upgrading my tripod to try and make it so that I could do more of an overhead look, because the amount of times that I would bump the tripod, bump the camera, or my head would completely obscure whatever I'm drawing was getting mildly frustrating. With the sketching complete, I started working in with colour. The first area that I decided to tackle was the bird's face. The first colour I'm using here is cream, and I come over the top of it with a few other yellows to help add depth and to help define the edges of the feathers on the face. I really wanted to make it look super fluffy because Pale-Faced Rosellas have the cutest little fluffy cheeks. And if you watched me draw my fairy wren, you'll know that I'm erasing the guidelines here because I'm using a light colour. And I learned the hard way that if you draw over the top of graphite with the Prismacolors, you'll be able to see the graphite through it. So throughout this whole drawing, I'll be erasing the graphite guidelines when I get to them if I'm using light colours. It's not so important with the darker colours. I'm using a super light pressure as I work through with the cream, just trying to add a base layer to build everything onto. And I'm focusing mainly on the areas of the bird's face where the yellows stand out a lot more. And And while I'm working through, you'll see me just make adjustments to the sketch, because as I work in colour I can kind of tell whether or not the proportions are how I want them to be or if they need to be adjusted. Once I get into building more texture and depth on the Rosella's face, I start using white to lighten the areas that aren't entirely cream coloured, and I'm using my other yellows to build in the shadows. The Rosella's face is more of a pale cream colour, with the yellows not really kind of being vivid until you get to the base of the neck. So here I come in with canary yellow, and I alternate between using canary yellow and deco yellow to blend out into the pale colours of the face. And then I start working on the beak. The beak is a very similar colour to the Rosella's face, but it has more of a green tone and some hints of browns and reds. So I start off by using ginger root, and I follow this into the feathers around the bird's beak, and also use it as a little bit of a base on the seed pods that it has in its mouth. I'm using a very light pressure because it's the base layer, and once I've laid the pigment down where it needs to be, I blend it out a little bit with cream and with white, and add a little bit more ginger root around the edges of the beak to darken where the beak meets the bird's face. To build up some of the brown and red tones that are in the bird's beak, I come in first with goldenrod and spread that around the part of the beak that looks the dirtiest in my reference photo. I use a very light pressure, and I'm not putting very much of this down at all. It's just to give the beak a little bit more shape and to balance out the green a little bit. I also carry this colour over to the feathers that are closest to the bird's beak, because they are kind of dirty in my reference photo. They've got whatever sap or nectar or whatever you want to call it that's from whatever the bird's been eating kind of transferred on them there. And then I come in with kelp green, and I use this mainly to create a bit of contrast around the edges of the bird's beak, and blend it out with white, ginger root and a little bit of cream. And then continue using the colour to add a little bit of colour to the feathers next to the bird's beak and to colour the seed pod that it is holding. And now that I've got the base for the head kind of started, I move on to laying down the base colours for the Rosella's belly. I start out using blue slate, focusing on the area near the bird's foot, and then blend it out a little bit with light cerulean blue because the blue slate isn't quite the right colour. I then blend both the colours together with sky blue light and work in some initial highlights using the sky blue light and white. As the feathers get closer to the bird's neck, they kind of transition from a blue tone to a tealy kind of blue. Instead of using blue slate and the light cerulean blue, I make the base colour sky blue light. It's way too light for this part of the bird's belly, but this part is just more about blocking in colour and adding a base for me to build on later. It also helps me to visualise what the whole bird will look like eventually. Still blocking in colours, I use ultramarine to block out the colour for the folded part of the Rosella's wing, before using more of the sky blue light to block out the colours for the tail and bottom half of the Rosella's back. And with that done, I start working on adding more details to the Rosella's face. I use peach beige to add shadows and definition around the feathers under the bird's beak, and really tried to kind of add a bit of a cloud-like texture here because, as I said before, Rosellas have the fluffiest looking cheeks and chins. I'm trying to use a very light pressure because this colour is slightly too dark, but I do come back over the top of it with the lighter colours to blend it out a bit more. I also use the peach beige to add a little bit of definition around the Rosella's eye, adding some feather details there too. And then I come back in with white and really focus on trying to make the areas that appear to be glowing in the light of my reference photo as bright as I possibly can. And then I start working on the Rosella's nose. Here I didn't have a colour that really lined up with the colour that it is. It's kind of between brown, red and grey. So I did what I always do and went head first in and just tried to blend a couple of colours together. I had no idea how it was going to look, but it actually really worked. So the colours that I blended together were 70% warm grey and chestnut. And I used both of these together, layering one on top of the other and then blending them out until I had achieved the colour that I wanted, before adding the highlights with 10% warm grey and 50% warm grey. I used the chestnut also to add a little bit of colour variation in the feathers around the Rosella's beak, trying to build more on the dirty look, especially for the feathers that are right next to the Rosella's mouth. And then I start working on my favourite part of any drawing, which is the eye. Ever since I was in high school, I have loved drawing eyes. Was never really much good at drawing animal eyes until recently. I don't really know why, they just capture me the way that they do. But anyway, I build the eye using 70% warm grey, 50% warm grey, 10% warm grey and 10% cool grey and black. Mainly using the 50% warm grey to draw the skin of the eyelid around the outside of the eye. I use 10% warm grey as a highlight for within the eye and for the eyelid, and use it to brighten the waterline. I'm trying to capture the reflections that you can see in the reference photo in the Rosella's eye, and I'm mostly using a light pressure until I start to kind of work in a little bit more of the detail, where I push a little bit harder so that you can see the lines a bit clearer. For a final bright highlight in the center of the reflection in the eye, I use 10% cool grey and white. And then I come back in with black to darken all of the edges and to sharpen up some of the lines inside the eye. And the eye is probably still my favourite part of this drawing. I then move on to working back into adding colour to the beak and the seed pod that the bird's carrying. There are quite a few red and purplish tones in this seed pod, so I'm using chestnut here to try and bring those to the forefront. And then I noticed an area near the bird's wing where I wanted to add a little bit more of the blue slate, so I quickly worked that back in. Can you tell that I'm procrastinating doing the seed pod because I don't really know how I'm going to get the colours to work together? Because I can. I use sky blue light to blend out some of the colour I've added and work it up towards where the feathers will start to change from blue to yellow. I'm trying here to smooth out this area because I felt that the texture of the paper was taking away from the colour a little bit too much. It was making it look a little bit pixelated, but I know that when I work in colours later on, it will gradually be less noticeable. And then I start working in some pale sage to try and create the transition from blue feathers to yellow feathers. I don't really use a lot of it here because the transition from blue to yellow is quite quick, but I add a little bit to this area on the wing and a little bit to the bird's neck. I was concerned that the pale sage was a little bit too dark, so I came in again with grey-green light, which is kind of the same tone but more of a white grey, obviously, and try to kind of just blend the colours out a little bit better. I still wasn't entirely happy with it, but I knew that I'd be able to fix it up later when I came back through to add more detail. And then here I start experimenting with adding a little bit more feather details to this area. I come in with light cerulean blue and my pale sage and just try to mix them together to make feather shapes. I wasn't entirely happy with how it looked to start with, but the more I kind of built on it, the better it started to look. I blend the feather details out with my other blues and with white before moving on to add some more of these textures to the bird's neck. And this is another example of me just going headfirst and trying a new technique out on a drawing rather than using a scrap piece of paper and experimenting with it before putting it on the main piece. As I'm working the feather details in further down the bird's chest, I actually add colour to the tip of the leaf that comes across the bird's chest. I just use pale sage and grey-green light just to remind myself what that area is. And then I wanted to build in some shadow on the bird's tummy. I also felt that the blues were a little bit too vivid, so I've tried to dim them out a little bit with slate grey. I also used the slate grey to add some texture to the feathers near the bird's foot. Then I moved back to the bird's head. There's a spot here where I didn't quite fully erase the graphite guidelines, and you can see it through the white. And I'm trying really hard to brighten that area so that you can't see it anymore, but I already know it's not going to work. And then you can't see it because my head gets in the way, but I further obsess over the shading in the Rosella's eye, and I just add a little bit more white to make the reflection a bit brighter. And with that done, I'm back to working on the Rosella's throat area. I'm trying to improve the way that the blue transitions to the yellow here, and also adding the feathers that stick out a little bit. The Rosella's face, where I'm further obsessing over the graphite line that I can still see here. I'm really worried that it will be obvious later on. Thankfully it's not. I wasn't happy with how light the Rosella's tummy was looking. It's actually not receiving any direct light in my reference photo, so I come in with Caribbean Sea to try and darken this little bit of the area here under the wing where it's actually the darkest. And then up near the foot there's a spot where the feathers are very vividly blue, and I've added some electric blue up here to help these feathers pop a little bit more. I've also used the electric blue here to add depth by isolating the spokes of some of the feathers and making it easier for me to create layers by leaving some bits uncoloured and colouring in other bits. This is a technique that I figured out when I was doing my first ever drawing using the Prismacolor pencils, so I'm using this method again and colouring the darker areas first so that I can leave space to add highlights later. Prismacolors are built in a way that you can build on top of colour, but I like to kind of plan where I'm putting darker colours first because I don't want to put all of my faith into using my white pencil or another lighter pencil to bring those highlights back and then not be able to do it later. And then, like I was saying, I come in with my lighter colour, which in this case is white, to do the highlight areas, and then I can use some of the mid-tones to build upon the lighter area without having to worry about putting too much pigment down that I won't be able to rescue it later. I am pressing quite hard when I do this because the more of the white pigment that I put down now, the more I'll be able to bring it forward later on. And then I come back in with my mid-tone blues and darker blues to just keep building on the texture. I did have to repeatedly sharpen my pencil here because when I'm trying to do a lot of the finer details like this specific part, the sharpness of your pencil will make or break the texture. It's fairly obvious and goes without saying, but you have a lot more control over where you put your pigment down with a sharper tip. I'm somewhat happy with how the feathers around the leg are looking. I go back to the Rosella's face and try to add a little bit more depth using artichoke to put some shadows around the fluffy feathers near the bird's chin. I'm mainly focusing here on trying to build depth and add a little bit more feather texture to some of these feathers. I'm not using a very firm pressure, and I'm also using this colour to add some more of the feathers that are sticking out from the bird's voice box area. Before putting my head in the way again and making it so you can't see my absolute obsessiveness taking over, trying to get these highlights to look exactly how I want them to. And overall just trying to lighten some of the texture lines that I added before because I felt they were a little bit too dark. And then I come in with apple green and focus on the area around the Rosella's mouth where some of the sap or pigment from whatever the bird is eating have transferred onto the feathers right next to its mouth. I'm using a very light pressure here because I just want to add the tiniest little hint of colour, and I blend it out with white and grey-green light just to make it look exactly how I want it to. Before deciding, I want the bottom part of it to be a little bit darker, so I come in with Kelly Green to add a little bit more shadows and shaping here, and I'm using short line strokes. And then I go back to working on colouring the seed pod that the bird's eating. I alternate between several different shades of green to try and achieve the look that I want. One of the colours I use here is Nectar, and I mix it with the greens to try and bring more of a warm tone out through the green. It's kind of a pale orangey pink kind of colour. And I layer on top of it again with some of my lighter greens and a little bit of white. I mainly focus on using the white where the light is shining off the somewhat shiny parts of the seed pod. And I just keep experimenting with filling in with the greens, trying to just give the seed pod a sense of depth and shape. And then I go back to working on the bird's head, coming in with my deeper yellows first. I'm building in the colour at the base of the bird's neck and getting a bit brave and adding some splashes of yellow to the mosaic kind of feathers that are on the Rosella's back. I was really nervous to do this part because I actually had forgotten by now what all of my graphite guidelines meant. So I'm kind of just going in gung-ho and hoping that it works out in the end. As you can tell, I'm using a very light pressure, and that's mostly because I want to be able to disguise any spots that I accidentally put yellow in. There's a small section on the Rosella's shoulder that's covered in these yellow and black feathers as well, so I'm just bringing the yellow a little bit over onto the wing so that when I start doing the wing in a minute, I know that those feathers are ones that I'm intending to be yellow. I'm trying not to put myself in the same position of not knowing what lines mean what when I'm doing the wing next. For the wing, I come in straight away with cobalt blue hue. It's a very bright and vivid blue, and it's not quite the right colour, so I already know that I will be doing a lot of layering like I did with my wren, but I'm focusing at the moment on just putting this pigment down so that I know which areas are for what, because some of the feathers on the Rosella's wing are bluer than others. And as you can see, it doesn't take me very long to completely chicken out of doing that. And instead I decide that now is the perfect time to put the base layer down for the Rosella's tail. So I'm starting by using cobalt turquoise, which is a greenish kind of toned greyish blue. It's not incredibly vibrant, but it's pretty close to the colour of the Rosella's tail. The top part of the tail is a lighter colour, and I block that out with Blue Violet Lake. And then my camera ran out of battery, but I moved on to working on the top part of the Rosella's back. The main colour I'm using here is powder blue, and I'm using a mix of powder blue with grey-green light to create a blend between both colours. And before I do too much of it, I make sure I erase all of my graphite guidelines because this is a lighter colour. And to build a little bit of texture and depth, I come in with indigo blue and use it to create the darker sections underneath the feathers. It's also to kind of make each feather stick out from the feathers that are underneath them. And then I use the indigo blue to define the shape of each feather near the bird's tail before filling all the feathers in with the powder blue. then you can tell that I get intimidated once again and decide to switch back to working on the Rosella's neck. And here I'm using 90% cool grey to add the black sections of each feather. I was very nervous doing this because I wasn't entirely sure which graphite shape was meant to be the darker shape, so I've tried to follow the reference image as well as I can, and in some places I've ignored where my graphite guidelines were. And unfortunately, my head keeps getting in the way, but I do get my tripod boom arm very soon, so this is an issue that will hopefully stop happening. And I'm using a very light pressure again just because I want to kind of roughly add in these spots. I'm not entirely sure if I want to commit 100% to them yet, but it's beneficial to have a base layer put down anyway. And while I'm using the 90% cool grey, I go ahead and add the base layer for the darker feathers on the Rosella's wing. And I'm being very conscious here to leave a space for the lighter part of each feather. I make sure that the pressure that I put when I'm doing the feathers at the end of the Rosella's wing is very light, because there's a lot of spots at the end of the wing where the feathers are actually reflecting the light. So I wanted to leave room for me to add those lighter spots later on. And then I work on darkening the underside of the Rosella's wing. I alternate between using a few different greys and use 30% warm grey to add in the lighter parts of the underside of the wing. And then I'm back working on the Rosella's back, and I layer over the powder blue with a little bit of sky blue light because I wanted the feathers to have more of a green tone to them. But the sky blue light isn't quite the right colour, and I wanted to add a little bit of a darker tone to accent the layers between feathers that's not quite as dark as the indigo blue. So I tried to use light cerulean blue to just darken the parts that are in the shade from the Rosella's far wing. And then to try and achieve my greener tone, I come in with light aqua, and I'm using a very light pressure just to add a little bit of a green tone to the darker parts of the shaded bits of the feathers at the top of the back, before lightening it with my lighter blues and white. And then I come back through and add a little bit more shadows and highlights with the indigo blue, the powder blue and the white, just blending them all out to build texture and depth. I did find here that because I'd put so much pigment down already, it was a lot harder for me to blend the white over the top of it. I think it's got something to do with the amount of pigment that was already on the paper. It kind of felt like the white pencil was actually pushing the layers underneath it off so that it made it darker in some spots, which was a little bit disappointing, but it's all learning and it's something I can definitely take into my drawing in the future to make sure I do a lot more lighter layers before pressing harder with the pencil. And then I build in the texture on the Rosella's leg with 90% cool grey, and I work back from the underside of the far wing just to try and give it a furry texture and highlight the individual barbs of the feathers here, because it is a very fluffy spot. I always find it easier to work textures like this in with the pencil, working from light to dark. So I always colour the lighter part first and then work the texture in with the darker colour afterwards. And then if I need to, I can go back in with white as a highlight to add a little bit more definition to those parts. I just find that it gives the cleanest result. I also have to make sure that I blow on the paper quite regularly using the Prismacolors, especially with a paper that's as textured as this one, because a lot of the pigments actually sit on top of the paper, and if they are in the way when I go to put another pigment down, the pencil will pick up on that and you'll be able to see it, especially if it's one of the darker colours. And I add some more darker spots between the feathers on the Rosella's back using indigo blue, and then blend them out with the colourless blender. I've never really been much for using this particular blender, but I felt like it was called for in this moment because I just wanted them to be a bit smoother and not have them washed out by whatever pigment I use over the top. And then I transition to working on the shoulder part of the Rosella's wing. I go through with 90% cool grey and lightly add the darker parts of each feather, just trying to block this out for when I come to do it later. The patterns on the bird are slowly starting to come to life, and I think that's why I had the confidence to do this now, because I could see the pattern start to come through on the Rosella's back, and I really wanted to see it brought through on the wing. I'm very careful to make sure I leave myself enough room to add the feather details between each feather. I'm trying to focus on just adding the darker pigment where it needs to be and leaving a little bit of a space around it, because I like to actually add the lighter feather details before I bring the darker details where they're supposed to be, so I can see the barbs from each feather when I come back through with the dark pencil later. And then while I'm adding these patterns, I go through and add them to what we can see of the wing on the other side of the Rosella. There's a spot here as well where you can see the underside of some of the feathers, and I use grey to bring that colour in a little bit, just to block it in. It's not perfect yet, I'll add the texture later on. And I make sure I go through and erase my guidelines first, because I wasn't actually happy with them and wanted to lift the wing a little bit further off where I had originally put it. And then using a very firm pressure with a relatively sharp pencil, I colour in the underside of the Rosella's wing, and I make sure after I do this to blow all of the darker pigments off the paper, because I want to be using light colours. And of course my camera lost battery again, but I've transitioned now to working in some more green tones down towards the Rosella's neck and adding some green tones to the yellow feathers and the feathers on the wing that are around there. And now that I've gained a little bit more confidence, I actually start working on some of the details on the folded section of the Rosella's wing. I work these in using indigo blue to start with. I'm trying to shape out each feather and leave some room next to each feather for the lighter barbs from the feathers next to them. With the rough outline of each feather finished, I come in with Blue Violet Lake to smooth out the colours a little bit and to put this down as a second base layer for these feathers. And then from here on, I alternate between white, cloud blue, periwinkle, blue violet lake, violet blue and indigo blue to build texture and depth. Adding the colour to this part of the drawing was actually one of my favourite parts. I don't know why, but I just started to see the whole drawing come to life after I'd finished this part of the Rosella's wing. And then I start adding some more of the darker sections of each feather, because I want to move on to the next layer of feathers on the Rosella's wing. Once they're added in, I start building in colour with violet blue. I use this to very lightly trace around the edges of each feather that are more blue in tone, and then I come back through with my lighter blue, making sure that it's the right colour, to add the lighter sections of the feathers here. And then I come through with periwinkle and indigo blue to build the spaces between the barbs of each feather and create more of a fur textured kind of look for these sections of feathers. Right around the dark part of each feather, there's a very bright outline, so I come through with white to try and make this work before darkening the inside part of some of the feathers. I use an alternation between 90% cool grey and black to darken the feathers, because some of them look a little bit lighter on the very middle of the darker spot. I've mainly focused the black on the very edge closest to the brightest edge to make the brightness pop a little bit more. And then I come through with 20% warm grey to create a very gentle reflection in the black part of each feather. And I just keep fiddling with my blues and my blacks to complete the rest of the feather textures and feathers on this section of the wing. I start working in the flight feathers in a very similar way, alternating between a few different blues, my blacks, my greys and my white to achieve the darker area of the feather and the lighter edges of each feather. I'm using much of the same method, adding my lighter colours first and then using my darker colours to build the texture of the feather. It's probably my favourite way to draw these because you get to watch them come to life. I find it very fun and I hope it's just as fun for you guys to watch it when you're watching the video. I get momentarily nervous and fix a few things on the folded part of the wing before coming back and adding a few more blue tones to the first flight feather. Peacock blue in the darker area of the wing to bring a little bit more of a greenish bluish greyish tone to the darker part of the feather here. I do the next few flight feathers in the same way as the first one, and making sure that I have an extra sharp pencil when I'm adding the texture with the darker pencils really helps to keep the lines clean. For the flight feathers that are closer to the Rosella's back, I start using 70% warm grey and 20% warm grey with my blacks for the dark part of the feather because they are actually reflecting some light, and I'm trying to blend the lighter greys in with the black and the darker greys to emulate this effect. I take turns layering each colour on top of the other colours and fiddling with it by adding some more black or adding some more darker grey just to try and get it to look exactly how I want it to. When I'm adding the black, I'm always using a very firm pressure because I'm trying to make it so that the colour is smooth, which means I have to flatten the paper down and press quite hard so that you don't see any of the paper textures come through the pencil when I'm finished. For the flight feathers at the top of the Rosella's wing, I add 90% warm grey to my rotation of colours that I'm using. This is because there's a slight more warm tone to these feathers in my reference photo and I wanted to emulate that as best I can. Since I don't really have an expert's level of experience working with these pencils, one thing that I've really enjoyed in this process is every single time I see a colour that I've never drawn before with them, it's always really fun for me to experiment with how they can blend together. And on the other side of the feathers here, so the side that's not dark, I'm mainly using slate grey and a combination of other greys to achieve the look that I'm going for. Because they aren't blue toned like the secondary flight feathers that I did before, they're just a little bit lighter than the other side of each feather. The feather that's closest to the right side here actually has some pretty interesting textures on it that I'm quite excited to try and do. You can actually kind of see the light reflecting off of each individual barb for the feather. I'm going to try and create that texture by alternating between different greys until I've got it looking how I would like it to. And then I go back through and finish off the other feathers by working the darker colours into the lighter colour of the feather next to it to build up the fluffy feathery texture. And then I come back through and add some highlights where I feel I need them. And once those flight feathers are done to a standard that I'm happy with, I go back over to the underside of the opposite wing and try to just make the colours look a little bit smoother. And that's where I'm going to stop this video. There will be 2 more episodes of me completing this artwork, and if you'd like to follow along and watch them, please make sure that you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you can be notified when I upload a new video. Editing is something that I'm still learning how to do, so my videos aren't uploading as frequently at the moment as I would like them to be. I think this project actually ended up having something like 17 hours of unedited footage. So if you'd like to stay updated in the meantime, please make sure you're following my Instagram and my Facebook page, because I will try to post at least once a week on there what I'm doing with my art stuff. Other than that, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week, and don't forget to stay inspired. See you next time.